For years, construction has measured safety in much the same way, by counting the number of injuries. Clearly, with total costs of fatal and non-fatal injuries topping 11 billion annually, that's not working. But why? And more importantly, what's the alternative? Today on Safe and Sound, we're going to tackle these two vital questions around construction safety with an expert whose research and findings shatter traditional safety models and lay a path for future construction safety measurement. I'm your host, Brad Tabone, co-founder and EVP of North America for Hammertech. And I'm pleased to be joined today by the perfect person to help us explore this topic in more depth, Matthew Halliwell. Matt is the director of the Construction Safety Research Alliance, an alliance of industry professionals and experienced scientists focused on transformative construction safety research. Matt is a President's Teaching Scholar and endowed professor of the construction engineering at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Before his academic career, he worked in construction as a labourer, project engineer, and quality inspector. So not just an academic. Matt has pioneered leading indicators, hazard recognition programs, safety risk assessments, and precursor analysis. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, which is 100 more than me, and has overseen over $3 million in external funding. For his research, he has received the National Science Foundation Career Award and the Construction Industry Institute Outstanding Researcher Award. Matt, excited to have you on the show. Those are some impressive credentials. About 100 more than me. Welcome.
Well, thanks for the nice introduction. It's great to be here, and what a good way to reach a broad audience here. So thank you for inviting me.
No, I've personally had an interest in data my whole kind of career. I used to work at a bank. Don't kill me, other people that are in the construction industry prior to construction, but never kind of got into the seriousness of kind of the analysis behind some of the metrics out there that I just took for granted. So really looking forward to today and kind of jumping into the analysis that was done around some metrics that since I moved here in the US, I use for everything from analyzing an internal company's performance to, owners choosing who to actually, put onto the job site, to insurance, to everything, and to kind of, see the tagline of, invalidity of TRR. Really, really excited to kind of jump into it with you and learn a bit more and share that across the globe.
For sure. In this topic, I think what you'll find as we talk through this is I'm probably not going to tell people things that they really didn't already know. But the one big change is we have a lot of statistical and scientific validity behind this. So, I bring some of the quantitative aspects, but I had a really, really good team of collaborators also at the university who helped out on that.
Yeah, so let's go a little bit more into the CRSA, because it was something that I came across. I think George actually within Hammertech came across last year in 2020. We caught up at the back end of 2020. I just found it kind of fascinating what the goals of CRSA and kind of the membership there. So just for the people listening in, can you just tell us a little bit more about CRSA?
Yeah, for sure. We're a pretty new organization, frankly. We're on our about year 2 here. Starting to lose track because time flies. And I've been doing research for going on 15 years myself. The Construction Safety Research Alliance was founded just a couple of years ago, and we've grown pretty rapidly. The thing that's a bit different about the organization is that it's a collaboration between the industry and academia. And frankly, I think it's a collaboration that should have existed a long, long time ago. But really what we do is, as academics, we bring the scientific rigor to the table. And the other flip side of this, from the academic side of things, the industry members bring the professional relevance, access to data that we would never have access to. And the collaboration between the two, it's really important because, the scientific rigor is great. But if we as academics bury our research in technical journals that no industry members are really reading, it's not all that impactful. So the Research Alliance is all about doing the research together, making sure the academics are practically relevant, making sure the practitioners are scientifically backed. And, together we can do things that, alone in our separate bubbles, we never would be able to achieve. So when we work together on these research teams, we'll have anywhere from 15 to 25 different individuals representing their respective companies. And then somewhere, between 2-3 folks from my team who are on the academic side. And for this topic that we're talking about today, we actually had a really big team. We had some folks from psychology and neuroscience. We had someone who focuses on hydroclimatology. These are the folks with the statistical background that far surpasses my own. So that's the benefit of the alliances. We get to collaborate all together, bring in experts when we need them, and do research really together and hopefully make a bigger impact at a more rapid pace.
Jumping into the research, which is the invalidity of the TRIR, your research kind of either, destroys what was the intent of it, or, at least backs up a whole bunch of, I guess, discussion that has been out there. Like you said, some of these findings were already kind of, out there as hypotheses or people's opinions or etc. For those that don't know what TRIR is, let's just say if you are in Australia, where obviously some of the audience is, it's the total recordable incident rate. And it's a construction safety measurement utilized here in the US. And it is the OSHA, which is the safety regulator out here, recordable incident rate scaled per 200,000 work hours. And again, for those in Australia or other parts of the world, this does not include near misses reporting. This is actual incidents that have occurred. Matt, can you talk to us a bit around the findings around TRIR?
So, I think it's probably appropriate to kind of set the stage with the background and where we started as our team. Anytime we have these research projects kick off, they are nominated and voted upon by our board of advisors. So this was a topic, the number one voted topic that we were studying in the first year that we existed. So you can imagine we were kind of chomping at the bit to get going on the study. And as a bit of like history in the United States, OSHA recordables, an OSHA recordable injury rate is something that, the government agencies are measuring and tracking from an industry level. It wasn't until later on that organizations started to use that metric really to represent, quote unquote, safety performance. The fact that we've been using TRIR in a variety of ways is not something necessarily imposed by the government, and simply we have some flexibility in terms of how we measure safety performance. You're not required to represent your safety performance as total recordable injury rate. You have the flexibility to represent it in different ways. OSHA may measure that from an industry perspective and learn if we're getting better or worse, or where the hot points are. But we have a lot of flexibility. But if we look at how TRIR has been used, it's largely the primary metric, at least stateside, of how we measure and track safety performance, benchmarking against peers. Is one company better than another company? Even within companies, comparing business units. And then perhaps now that we know the research findings, which I'll explain here in a moment, the most egregious sort of statistical violations are, using it to pre-qualify contractors if you're a client organization, or, even, using TRIR as a metric for performance evaluations within the company. So, where this started was, the project started was a lot of our members were saying, we've long thought that this metric, TRIR, is not necessarily the most valid measure of safety performance. And, some of the things that were arising this suspicion was that if you look at small contractors, for example, only one injury could dramatically increase your number, right? And so, especially for the smaller folks, it's very unstable, but yet, can really have
huge impacts, right? Especially when they're compared, if they're a company looking to, move from a tier 3 contractor up to a tier 2 contractor, and you're going to be compared against other people who, may have larger data sets or larger worker hours, where it kind of starts smoothing this out a little bit compared to, the erratic nature of smaller contractors, therefore smaller hours, therefore one incident or injury can kind of blow it out. I mean, it's an unfair kind of assessment to kind of put them against each other, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you look at one small contractor having one injury, if they're only having, say 200,000 worker hours or 500,000 worker hours a year, they're going to be over that sort of magic threshold of one that many clients will use as a pre-qualification threshold.
It's literally impossible to get below one, right? at that point in time, right? If you just got one,
you're done until the year resets or something like that. And you get to start over. And so our industry members were definitely looking at this saying, we need to understand, how we should be using TRIR, if at all. And our motivation was to understand, from the statistical standpoint, understand the distribution of recordable injuries. And a way to say that, more practically is, we wanted to know, to what extent are recordable injuries sort of predictable and following some sort of patterns, right? And to what extent is it just random in terms of when they occur? Because, anecdotally, a lot of our membership would say, we don't have injuries spaced at regular intervals. Sometimes they cluster, sometimes they're very far apart. We have, quote unquote, good months and bad months and things like that, even though we're not changing our underlying safety system that rapidly. We launched the study, and our first step along the way was to ask for the injury history for our membership. A year ago, when we were asking for these data, we were talking about, about 25 of the industry leading companies who have amassed, millions and millions of worker hours. In fact, the entire data set had about 3.2 trillion worker hours worth of exposure. And
when I saw the T, and that's for everybody, just in case you didn't hear what Matt said, trillion worker hours, that's kind of where I guess looked at the study and realized the sheer amount of data that actually has gone into this. This is not just some small kind of collaboration of 10 million worker hours. It's trillions of worker hours worth of data over, I think it was a decade. Was that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we asked people to go back as far as they had reliable data. That's one of the great things about the Alliance is that we can make that request and it's fulfilled. That's a tough ask sometimes with the legal requirements and some of the...
People just don't like sharing that data.
Yeah.
For those, at Hammer Tech, sometimes we have great stories with people over, 5, 6, 7 years and we want to share it. And that data doesn't really want to get out there in the public. So I guess that's one of the great things about kind of, the relationship between academia and industry coming together is that you get access to that data.
Exactly. It can be sensitive. The nice thing is they shared it. Once we had that great data set, that's where we brought in some of the leading statistical experts that we have at the University of Colorado to help advise myself, because I have a statistics background as well. But, we really wanted this study to be absolutely bulletproof from a review standpoint. In academia, we have to pass the rigors of peer review. So other scientists review the quality and rigor of our work before it's allowed to be published. So we brought in a couple of guys. I had my PhD student, Dr. Rico Salas, who has since graduated, and then 2 other colleagues with a really heavy statistical background, Matt Jones from psychology and neuroscience, and Balaji Rajagopalan from our department who studies hydroclimatology. But I mentioned that to say that, we went into a deep dive into the data to understand, like I said, the distribution of TRIR. And the interesting finding right away, and this is with no assumptions about, the way that TRIR behaves, just letting the data speak to us. It really showed that when an injury happens is about 98% random, meaning there's no predictable pattern to it. It's pretty well random. So no feedback loops or anything like that are statistically measurable. It's really pretty random. That's so helpful from a statistical standpoint. It tells us how to treat and model this value. We can not make any assumptions about, how this thing distributes itself. It's not your normal bell curve, right? That's pretty obvious. It's pretty extreme events. We're talking about very rare things. And so once we had that, figured out, we knew that this TRIR was following what's called a Poisson distribution. And that opened up a lot of doors once we have, that understanding to answer some really big questions.
Sometimes for those out there, Matt, that safety is a new space. And I think getting confidence in safety data and actually getting the practical application of it on the job site is what the most important thing of all this is, right? And I think some people can get caught up, who don't have an understanding, can get caught up in the statistical of it and what does this mean and what is Poisson model and all the rest of it, and do I need to understand that to actually take the learnings out of the study or believe in the study? And I think the key thing that I kind of, have around these sort of things is when it's kind of peer reviewed and there is models actually built on science and it has the characteristics of to actually fit into certain models. I think, people like myself who want to then apply it to the job site should be looking at this data and should be looking at the insights, etc., that have gone through a peer review. And instead of kind of, please go out and educate yourself, but at the same time, you can kind of safely rely on that, it does fit the model and the outputs of it are something that is statistically, valid and kind of science-backed.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way of putting it. This paper, when we put it out, it's gotten a lot of traction really quickly. We put it out as a white paper as we are submitting for peer review. And we did that to get to our audience instead of waiting for, 2 years through the peer review process. When people come across a white paper, that's a little bit tricky, right? Because it has not yet gone through the peer review process. What you need to do, my recommendation as we get people who are now consuming safety science a little bit more now that the science of safety is starting to emerge, is you really got to look at who did the work, right? And what's the background and read through the descriptions that are provided. And then ultimately the peer review process shakes out as well. Just a bit of a caveat though, this was shared as a white paper, yet the work by my PhD student, Rico Salas, was published and there's a PhD defense committee and all of that. So a peer review of sorts, if you will, as well.
In terms of, I guess, the takeaways of the data, there was kind of, the occurrence of recordable injuries almost entirely random, 98%, which you mentioned before. There's no discernible association between total recordable incident rate and fatalities. TRIR is not precise and should not be communicated to multiple decimal points of precision. In nearly every practical circumstance, it is statistically invalid to use TRIR to compare companies, business units, projects, and teams. They were kind of the main takeouts. I mean, if this is kind of looked at and come up with this as, TRIR is invalid, what's the alternative out there?
It's a great question. In fact, the Research Alliance has selected alternatives to TRIR as the 2021 project that the Board of Advisors will be tackling. I think you summarized the findings really succinctly. What I'll share is a little bit about what makes for a good metric. And I think we have to start there so that we don't just go down a different path with a new metric with the same old problems. Imagine if somebody says, well, we had, 3 injuries over, 1.2 million worker hours, and our number was whatever that number computes out to be. That's not a wrong number. I want to make sure that everybody understands that. There's nothing wrong about that number. It is a rate, it is a number, but the way we use it is wrong. It's assuming that the safety system was designed and executed to produce only that result. I did a little activity recently at a conference that I was presenting at, and I gave everybody dice, right? And I said, I want you to roll the dice. Everybody's got the same ones, right? I want you to roll the dice 10 times and tell me the total number that you rolled. And you'll see a distribution across the whole room, right? And you'll see, everybody gets everything from a small number to a very large number and everything in between.
Which is why casinos make lots of money on crap. Sorry.
Well, exactly. That because they understand how to use the data in the right way to make a strategic conclusion, right? My purpose for doing that activity was to show them you all have the same dice, but you got different results. That's randomness at work, right? And so when we look at the TRIR as a metric, I pulled one up here just as a reference point. Let's say you've got a recordable injury rate of 1. Right? 1 injury per 200,000 worker hours. If you wanted to really be able to report that precisely, right, knowing there's random variation, and you wanted to say, I know it's somewhere between 0.95 and 1.05, you'd need 307 million worker hours to be able to draw that conclusion. So I mention that because if we're going to replace TRIR as a metric, one of the major problems with it is that we're recording rare events. The main reason that we have so much variability there is that a recordable injury in most modernized industries is a rarity. And so, to get to something that we're actually able to report with some precision that's relevant, we need something to measure that happens more frequently, right? And we need that metric, whatever it is that we're measuring, to reflect what we care about the most. And so, I have a lot of organizations who will say, I shouldn't be spending so much time on a 2-stitch cut to the finger when I had a near miss over there that, could have resulted in a fatality. And yet in the recordable injury TRIR metric, those two are both counted as a tick in the box, right? They both count as one, even though they're obviously very different. One of the things that I've been really passionate about over the last year is thinking about this alternative TRIR metric. I think a lot of folks will go to leading indicators being the solution. I think that's part of the solution. So leading indicator, in my mind, typically represents measuring something in the safety system. Now, I think that's going to be part of the solution, but I don't think that's the only solution, right? So that's on the upstream. People, if I was a CEO of a company, I'd say that's great, but I still want to see the output. I want to see what the system produces. And I think that there's a huge opportunity in our observation programs. And what I mean by that is not counting how many observations we do or the pictures that we get. But when we go and we visit a site, if we look around that site and we see our hazards, right, the energy sources that are out there, and we look for the ones that have that potential to be serious, right, if something were to go wrong, we look especially at those what I call high energy or high impact hazards, and we assess the controls. Do we have adequate controls against those high energy sources so that if somebody, made a mistake, for example, which people will, that they're not going to be fatally injured as a result. If we look at our site and we see that those energy sources are controlled, that's what we want the system to be producing. If we walk on site for a visit and we see those high energy sources uncontrolled, that's still an output of the system. And I think the reason why this is going to be potentially a good alternative metric is that we can go do observations at whatever rate we want, right? Whatever we have the resources to do. We don't have to wait for an injury in order to count something and measure something. And it is reflective, if we're looking at especially the high impact hazards and their controls and assessing those controls. It's reflecting what we care about the most. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. It's something that needs to clearly be fleshed out. What does it mean to have an adequate control and what exactly am I measuring? But I see that as being, my own mind and the research that I've done. I think that's really a sweet spot for us.
Got you. And look, this is a subject of much passion for me. And I guess, was one of the reasons why personally I was one of the co-founders of Hammertech, was looking at the safety industry, worldwide. So this is not a problem for the US around, data and what data to utilize. And one of the biggest problems we initially saw was, I guess, everyone looking at lag indicators and not actually getting any of the leading indicators, which you talked about initially. And so, my initial thoughts were, okay, well, let's build a system that kind of, enables collaboration, gets everyone on the job site together, and we can start, if everyone's working in the system, collaborating and doing kind of their processes in the system, then we can have data points and start capturing all the activities that occur, therefore the leading activities. And so, we released our leading indicator dashboards in 2018, which were kind of, near real time. And our clients at the time were, and still are, kind of, blown away by this kind of, new access to data and can kind of finally understand, have people actually done all their compliance as a part of the safety system before they get onto the job site? Are they doing their observations, etc.? But then again, that quickly for me was like, okay, well, that's not actually the golden goose. It's very important. It's data that can very much move the needle, but it isn't, the holy grail, and you can't move away from kind of your lag indicators. So, we started looking at, it's definitely in the application of, okay, well, here are the leading indicators around, are we actually, managing, I guess, the job as per our safety management system? But then, you touched on a really, really important bit, which is those kind of high risk, in Australia, I think there's about 21 high risk activities. And it's about not only observing and understanding which of those activities are on the job site and whether or not you have the right controls or hierarchy of controls in place. It's also feeding that data through to the individual worker on a regular cadence that will truly bridge that kind of indicator analytic to actually having application on the job site. And so say here in the state side, it's getting that information into the worker's hands as a part of maybe the pre-task planning process, where does your pre-task plan got maybe energization or working from heights? And so do you believe kind of the true next step in kind of applying kind of, safety metrics and having an impact on the job site is not just having some kind of measurement? Because I know that you practically get out there, Matt. Do you kind of see that as the future, which is bridging the gap, find the right measurement, the right measurements and data and the right set, I guess, not just throwing a bunch of metrics at them, but providing them actionable insights? Do you see that kind of being the bridge and the kind of way that we're heading?
I do. I mean, I think that, from the management standpoint, we have to look at metrics, for example, as more holistically, right? It's not just about leading. It's not just about lagging. I think, we can look at, what we're doing in the safety system. What activities are we doing to keep people safe and how well are we doing them? We can monitor those activities and make changes along the way before something bad happens, right? And then we can measure the output. But I think you're right. In terms of if we want to be proactive, right, we need to give the safety team better leading indicator information so they know how to throttle things up and down and where to put more emphasis. But we also do need to get more and better information to the field, right? In terms of the people who are about to get, start their job that day, getting them more intelligence and more information that would help them to make a better decision, right? And I think that the role of technology in my mind is to really help people do the things that either they don't have time to do, they don't want to do, or, they're not good at doing. And examples of that is sometimes, any human being is not going to be perfect at recognizing hazards, right? Without proper training, we think we're awesome at it, but we're terrible, all of us. And so I think getting people that sort of information based on real data and real analysis is part of the future. And part of it also from, my academic side, I think it's going to be being able to communicate to people what this information means and how they can use it. Because our knee-jerk reaction often is like, here's some data. And the worker's knee-jerk reaction is, I already knew that. And I think there's going to be some education from everybody, from the CEO to the person who's, it's the first day on the job, on how to, use and communicate and respond to data.
And that's kind of what I've always seen is, here's some data. I already knew that. Nothing comes out of it. nothing changes, and we keep all doing the same thing, thinking we know what's going to happen, and therefore incidents keep happening. And like we said, $11 billion kind of thing, and that's not even the kind of worst bit about the human element of it is the impact of the humans. And I think that's kind of why we, as an industry and academia and everyone coming together, really, really need to focus on not just the metric side, but also getting in the hands of the workers and in an understandable, actionable state where they actually practically want to apply it. Question for you. With technology coming up, what are you most excited about around kind of the future of technology? Is it computer vision? Like, what is kind of, what is a bit that you are most excited about, technology-wise in assisting in kind of, practically kind of moving that needle and assisting with kind of the measurement?
I'm not a technologist myself. In academia, I get to collaborate with a lot of really talented people. And we've been exploring a few things ourselves actually related to technology. I think really there are a few different ways I think that technology is going to help and really transform work. One, I do think, is machine vision. And for your audience who doesn't necessarily know what that term really means, I explain it to people as, using cameras and, algorithms behind the scenes to use the visual world basically to detect things, right, that are relevant in the environment. And whether or not that's being able to, use machine vision and identify equipment and people and use, artificial intelligence to make a prediction of, when there might be a collision, for example. I think these are going to be really impactful technological advances that could change everything. They could really transform the industry. Another is making safety predictions, using the data that we do have to at least predict the risk of high impact events that are so rare, right? Some of us may never experience one of these in our entire career, but if you use enough data, you can use that intelligence and, the kind of the collective wisdom in that data to help people understand when they're at elevated risk for, a serious injury or fatality, for example. A lot of the potential for transformation lives in the AI space, whether it's, using cameras to monitor the site and know when there's, potential for harm, whether it's, machine learning algorithms that help us to understand, based on the work we're doing today, what's the most likely outcome, or even, using natural language processing and, other language-based techniques to help us, distill all of the text-based data we have into some robust data sets that can help us to analyze risk better. Those are where I see some high potentials, at least from my seat, as a technical advisor to the industry and as an academic.
Fascinating. And I mean, I'm in total agreement. I think either machine vision or computer vision combined with, greater human technology application, I think is really, really important. We capture tens of millions of observations, and the ones that always make me laugh is where another safety manager or a VP of safety comes in over the top and has a look at some of the observations and tags another 3 or 4 issues in the same picture that the person, they might be saying, okay, there's tripping hazards here, but meanwhile, there's 2 people in there not wearing any hard hats and something else, right? And I think the other bit is the predictability, which is something that has annoyed me in the industry personally, Matt, because I think there's a lot of people out there that spruik predictability, and a lot of people get caught out and therefore lose confidence in the predictability. I think, and I'd love your opinion on this, but I think if we're truly looking at predicting what possible risks are and looking to overcome them, we've got to make sure that the data sets that the prediction of this is coming out of. But it's not about just buying, a service or some product, looking over your 600,000 hours of work and suddenly you believe or someone tells you they can predict what's going to happen. Predictability for me is, large data sets, the statistically relevant that, you can tap into and kind of say, okay, well, I'm going to be doing this today. What do you think over, let's just say 3.2 trillion worth of hours could happen compared to over 1 million worth of hours captured might happen? What are your opinions on that?
I share your opinions. Frankly, it's a source of frustration for me when I've been doing predictive analytics and risk-based, research for my entire academic career. And so it's a bit frustrating when I see, say, a new provider who says, oh, we can make this prediction. And you look under the hood and you aren't allowed to look under the hood, which is the worst, right? It's no transparency. Or you do get a glimpse under the hood and it's one of those facepalm things where I look at it and I say, oh, this is absolute garbage. And so I tell people, anytime somebody comes up to you and says, we have a tool that will predict this thing, have a healthy level of skepticism about it, because everybody can make a prediction, right? It's like everybody can do a statistical analysis. You can get a free software platform, spout off some stuff that you found on Wikipedia and sound like an expert. And it's really hard these days, I think, for people to sift through what is a good prediction and what's a bad one. It's like an opinion. Everybody has one.
What's a good opinion and a bad one? Right?
But yeah, some people's opinion about things are better than others. And we're living that in the pandemic, right? It's like you can't just listen to everybody, and what somebody says on Facebook or LinkedIn is not necessarily the truth. I think people don't generally understand how difficult it is to make a prediction, right? I mean, it seems like something that we should be able to do it right off the cuff. And to give you an example, we wrote, a series of papers from a National Science Foundation project that we did on safety prediction. And I had a team of 12 people working full time for 3 years to make one predictive model. I mean, it's hard to get a tank of people with that level of skill together for that period of time to do one focused thing. And it's, and so if you're a consultant and you put together a predictive model in a weekend, it's probably not going to make the best predictions.
No, it's probably why, my CTO, who's much, much smarter than I am, I won't let him kind of, I'll give him that one kind of bit of appreciation. But kind of, in the past when I've looked at him and gone, God, surely it's just easy. We can just predict this stuff. And he just looks at me and just goes, no, in time. And I was like, okay, sure. Surely it can't be that hard, right? Just a weekend's worth of work. Turns out it's a little bit more, Matt. Indeed. I got a final question for you before we kind of wrap up, because I could talk to you for hours, but random one for you, and you may or may not have some kind of thoughts or opinions on it. But one of the, I guess, items that has most baffled me or confused me whilst being stateside, and I'm not sure kind of what impact, I can hypothesize what impact this has on, say, an incident rate like TRR, but near misses are something that are not. Obviously, they're still random, about as random as incidents, in my opinion, but I'm not going to ask you to confirm that because, you haven't looked into it. But because there's no near-miss reporting that is kind of mandated by the regulator, OSHA, which then forms, a part of a possible kind of, incident near-miss rate, which gives, in my opinion, at least a lot more data and a lot more kind of incidents to jump in there, which may lower the threshold of the amount of hours. I think you mentioned before about 307 million hours. What are your opinions around kind of near-misses, and do they have a place in probably more so the lag data side of things? So, a crane falls over, or a Manitou falls over and doesn't crush somebody, doesn't, hurt somebody, therefore isn't it kind of reported. What's your opinion on near misses, and kind of have you looked into that at all? It's just something that fascinates me because let's just say in the UK or Australia, etc., you don't report a near miss to the authorities, you can be put in jail because it's looked at as serious as an incident. So I'm just kind of interested in academia, but also someone that's been on the other side of, I know you spend a part of your career on the other side as well, with practical application into the industry. So just wanted your opinion.
And for your listeners, we actually didn't plan this question out in advance, and I say that because your question, it's a great one, and I actually just this year finished a project. I was serving as the technical advisor to an Edison Electric Institute team. We had, I think, about 20 people, kind of like our research alliance, but more in the industry space. We were dealing with a lot of these questions that you were just asking about near misses.
I'm happy that it's just even getting talked about, because no one talks about near misses here.
I'll pose a couple of challenges, right, of near misses. This was our starting point. The first is, we as an industry don't have a great definition of what a near miss is. And more importantly, we don't have a definition of what a near miss isn't, right? And so to give you an example, and I use this example with a lot of folks, imagine that I've got a worker at 20 feet of height, and they're holding a heavy tool, and there are workers working beneath them, and they drop that tool. If it comes crashing down to the ground right beside somebody and they don't get injured, that's obviously a near miss. Everybody agrees. But what if that person has a tool lanyard on, right? And they drop the tool and it gets caught by the tool lanyard. Didn't hit anybody, but you get the idea. There's that one control in place. When I asked the group, I posed that question. I asked that group. We were all over the board. Yet everybody's really confident in their response. And then the one example that is the most challenging, I think, is imagine you've got a worker at height and they've got a fall arrest system on that's installed, inspected, used properly and everything, and they do fall and they get caught by that lanyard. Is that a near miss? I posed it to 24 people in a room in Chicago, and I had 12 people say yes and 12 people say no. And the people saying yes are like, oh, it's obviously, that's what my gut feel says, yes, it has to be. And the other 12 said, well, they had a control and the control did its job. And so, I just kind of, expand on that a little bit just to say, it's challenging to know what should be counted and what shouldn't. And if we're going to move to near misses as a potential metric, we as an industry have to create an underlying definition that we all agree upon. And that's one of the reasons that recordable injury rate has been so powerful, is that there is a number and everybody's, in theory, with some variation, but measuring it pretty much the same way. A recordable is a recordable. There are guidelines on what is and what isn't, and we follow it. But with near misses, we don't have that. So that's been a challenge. The other challenge is we have a lot of folks who are talking about a new metric or a new value called PSIF, potential serious injuries and fatalities. And the next step there is not only do we have to reconcile what a near miss is, but we also have to understand when that near miss had the potential to be serious. And I think where people default to is they think, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And I tell folks that if you don't get to fatality in every single thing, then you're just not being creative enough, because the worst thing that could happen is always a fatality. So we have to look at, what's the most likely outcome and so on. And so all of that to say, we had a really robust process that we followed, and we formed some of these definitions, and they exist now within a new publication that was released just this past year called the Safety Classification and Learning Model. And it provides definition of, what is that near miss, or what is an incident? When is a control sufficient and not sufficient? And how do you assess whether or not the situation really had the potential to be a serious injury or fatality or not? And it's all based on some underlying scientific data that were collected in advance of the study. So I think you're right. Near misses really have high potential once we get a good definition and that metric is reliable. And the other thing we have to always focus on too with near misses is we have to also think about reporting culture, right? So for the short term, I always ask people, do you want a high number of near misses or a low number of near misses? On one side, if we get a lot of them, we know that our reporting culture is open, but we have a lot of near misses, right? On the other side, if we don't have very many, is it because we don't have many incidents or because we don't have an open reporting culture? For a while, that metric is going to be, it's not unidirectional. It's kind of in both directions, and it doesn't carry much meaning until we figure out what the metric means and we get a good opening reporting structure. Then that value is going to carry a lot more meaning.
Couldn't agree more. And I think hopefully if there's any takeouts of today's conversation is that nothing is quick and easy. And if anybody's looking for any quick or easy to move the needle continuously on safety and look at data requires reporting, capture of data requires definition. I always laugh at, is it recordable.com? I go there and, I think there's 124 at the moment kind of questions, ranging from, antibiotics administered as a precaution or, stepped on a toy while working from home. All these kind of, and these are questions that have come from people. And this is around something that is supposed to be, understood, an incident, let alone going into the kind of the near miss space or the potential of serious, injury or fatality. And I think none of this is easy. And I think as an industry and group, it's something that we just kind of have to keep asking the hard questions and keep moving forward with and not kind of just doing the same thing and expecting a different result. In terms of, wrapping up today, Matt, do you see a positive future for safety data? Are you seeing a positive momentum?
I mean, I really do. Being an academic who focuses on safety research, there's a real surge in interest in data-driven, evidence-based safety. And that is extremely encouraging to me, as you can imagine. But it's really an interesting thing to watch, right? Is to see people starting to really ask, well, where's the evidence for this? Where's the data? And do some of the hard work that's required behind the scenes to get to a reliable conclusion. And so as academics, I encourage people to look to us if you want something carefully done that follows the scientific method and proper rigor with, people who know their stuff, like this, statisticians and things like that. That's what we do. We're slow, right? People hate academics because we're so slow, but we do it the right way, right? I mean, that's what we do. And we're not going to throw something off the cuff and share it with people until it's ready. But, I'm encouraged these days. I think there's a bright future in safety. I think we're in a bit of a transition from more of a theory-based, field to a more scientific-based field. And I'm excited to see people, make that transition. And I'm always open to give advice to people on how to consume scientific information, because that's not necessarily always intuitive. So,
amen to that. I couldn't agree more. I think, the shift over the last 3-4 years compared to, the previous probably 5-6 that I've been involved in industry has
has shown there is a shift. There's a shift occurring at the moment, and it's great to see. People are utilizing technology, people actually looking at their data sets and not just relying on what was, but actually looking at how do we actually get better data sets, more relevant metrics, questioning the validity of things. I think we're in that transition phase of moving from the old world into wherever we get to. I don't know where we're going to get to, but it never really stops as one final destination, but it's definitely moving into a greater space. Matt, thank you so much for coming on today and kind of, sharing your great insights around the emerging science of construction safety measurement. I really appreciate having someone, from the academia world, but also has, application in the actual real world of these things. Thank you everyone for being with us today and throughout this podcast series. If you haven't heard the other episodes in the series, I hope you'll check them out. The series can be found wherever you get your podcast from and at constructiondive.com. Until our next conversation, this is Brad Tabo. Stay safe out there. And Matt, thanks again for being with us, mate.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.